David Gilmour is not simply a musician. He is the echo of silence turned into song.
I can ease your pain, get you on your feet again.
The man whose fingertips carved pain into eternity, who transformed grief into cathedrals of sound that still stand tall in the hearts of millions. When he lifted the black Stratocaster and let it cry, the world stopped. One note from him was enough to hold an entire stadium in breathless silence. He was not just playing music. He was bending human sorrow into melody, shaping invisible wounds into something that could be heard, felt, and never forgotten. For decades, Gilmour's solos were not performances but prayers. The soaring ache of Comfortably Numb, the trembling lament of Shine on You Crazy Diamond, the hypnotic weight of echoes. Each piece was more than sound. It was survival. It was transcendence. It was the voice of a man who had walked through storms most could not imagine, and returned with songs that healed the world. But every masterpiece he gave us was forged in blood and silence. Behind the soaring music lived a man shaped by heartbreaks too cruel to name. A friend left behind in madness. A brother in harmony taken by merciless illness. A bandmate whose betrayal cut so deep it felt like erasure. Each wound should have broken him. Each fracture could have ended the story. And yet he endured, turning every scar into sound, every silence into eternity. Now, at 79, when the world believes he has earned peace after a lifetime of storms, an unsettling truth lingers. A shadow still clings to him, silent yet heavy, reminding us that even the greatest legends are not spared from tragedy. And so, millions are left asking, what specter still haunts the quiet genius of Pink Floyd? Before we step into this journey, pause for a moment. Honor David Gilmour. Leave a tribute for the man who turned unbearable silence into beauty, who gave voice to grief when words were powerless. For every legend is not born out of triumph alone, but from wounds too deep to ever fully heal. For David Gilmour, that wound began with silence. A silence so merciless it carved every note he would ever play. A silence so haunting it followed him through childhood, into fame, and even into the twilight of his life. And it is here, within that silence, that our story begins. Childhood and silence. David Gilmour was born on March 6, 1946, in Cambridge, England. On paper, it looked like privilege. His father, Douglas, was a respected zoologist and lecturer at the university. His mother, Sylvia, was a teacher who later worked as a film editor. Their home in Grantchester seemed like the picture of stability. Books lined the shelves, academic conversations filled the air, and the family belonged to the middle-class security of post-war Britain. But for the quiet boy sitting at the dinner table, it was something entirely different. It was not chaos, not poverty, not the violence that breaks bones. It was something more insidious. A silence so thick it pressed against his chest. Conversations floated around him, but none of them reached him. Affection was muted. Warmth was rare. Years later, Gilmour himself would call it a forgotten void. A house full of intellect but empty of presence. A place where love was rationed, and loneliness was not spoken but lived. He had siblings, but belonging always slipped away. He would retreat into his own thoughts, into the walls of his room, where silence was both punishment and protection. And then, at just 10 years old, fate handed him salvation. His mother placed a guitar in his hands. She did not know then that she had just altered the history of music. There was no teacher, no formal guidance. Only a lamp burning through the night and a boy hunched over the strings, pressing, bending, coaxing emotion out of wood and wire. It was not practice. It was survival. Every riff repeated until his fingers ached was not an exercise. It was the only language he had in a home that did not speak to him. While other children shouted in playgrounds, David carved grief into sound. He bent the strings until they cried. By 13, shadows pressed harder on his mind. He had already begun contemplating mortality, haunted by how brief life could be. In classrooms, he was present but distant, uninterested in marks or popularity. He was simply the quiet boy with a guitar, rehearsing solitude until it turned into song. This was not a childhood of broken glass or violent arguments, but of something far worse, a silence that starved the soul. And yet, within that silence, he forged resilience. He learned to turn absence into endurance, loneliness into cathedral-like soundscapes. The boy no one truly listened to became the man whose guitar could silence oceans of voices. The silence did not break him. He broke the silence, and from it he gave the world some of the most hauntingly beautiful music ever created. Early struggles and hungry years. By the early 1960s, David's path was uncertain. While his former classmates Syd Barrett and Roger Waters were carving their names into London's psychedelic underground, Gilmour was still wandering in search of a stage. He joined small local bands like Joker's Wild. His playing was extraordinary, soulful, expressive, unique, but opportunities were scarce. Fame was a door locked tightly from the inside, and David was still waiting in the rain outside. So he and his friends set out for Europe. They drifted to France, chasing the dream of music across a continent that barely noticed them. But the road was merciless. Guitars disappeared, amplifiers were stolen, money evaporated. Some nights, the only choice was unthinkable: pawn the very guitar that carried his soul, just to buy bread. In Paris, in roadside cafes, on cobbled streets where tourists passed without listening, David strummed for coins. He lived not on applause, but on survival. To the world, Pink Floyd was rising. To David, Europe was a long road of hunger, empty stomachs, and calloused fingers. When he finally returned to London, he had nothing. No gear, no band, only determination that refused to die. And then fate struck a crueler blow. He visited a studio where Pink Floyd was recording. There he saw Syd Barrett, the boy he had once busked with on Cambridge streets, now fronting one of Britain's most talked-about bands. But this was not the same Syd. His eyes were glazed, his speech broken, his movements slow, erratic, unrecognizable. The spark of genius that had once seemed unstoppable was dissolving under the weight of heavy drug use and untreated illness. Doctors would later recognize it as schizophrenia-like symptoms, but in that moment, all David saw was a friend slipping beyond reach. The boy who had once painted sound in colors no one else could imagine was fading into madness. And David stood there, powerless, not only as a friend, but as a witness to brilliance unraveling. It was not just heartbreaking, it was terrifying. Because watching Syd Barrett's collapse meant watching a dream fall apart. And it was a dream David had once shared. Syd Barrett, an entry into Pink Floyd. By 1967, Pink Floyd was unraveling. Syd Barrett, their visionary leader, was increasingly unable to perform. His guitar hung limp around his neck during shows, his eyes vacant under the spotlight. The band stood on the edge of collapse. In desperation, they turned to David Gilmour. At first, it was not a replacement, but a patch. A fifth member meant to cover for Barrett when he could not play. For a few surreal shows, Pink Floyd stood as 5 men on stage, 4 playing, 1 drifting in silence. David would later recall the unbearable sight of Syd, guitar hanging useless, unmoving as the music swirled around him. Soon, a quiet decision was made. On the way to a gig, the band simply stopped picking Syd up. That night, David Gilmour became the lead guitarist of Pink Floyd. To fans, he was the man stepping into a legend's shoes. But to David himself, he was the man who had just abandoned his friend to madness. That guilt followed him forever. Every note he bent into the night carried the shadow of Syd Barrett, the friend he could not save. Joining Pink Floyd was not triumph. It was survival. The band was drifting, lost without their founding visionary. And David, suddenly thrust into the spotlight, was uncertain whether the music even made sense anymore. Their first post-Syd album, A Saucerful of Secrets, 1968, was less a statement than a lifeline, a desperate attempt to keep the dream alive. They played film soundtracks like More, 1969, and Obscured by Clouds, 1972, Not glamorous work, but survival. But in those shadows, David began sharpening his voice, his long delay effects, his aching bends, his infinite sustain. It was here that his signature sound, the sound that would one day hush stadiums into silence, was born. And then, from that fog of uncertainty, something miraculous emerged. In 1971, they recorded Metal. Its centerpiece, Echoes, was a 23-minute epic that filled an entire side of vinyl. The opening ping of David's guitar cut through like a lighthouse in darkness. By the end, the music swelled into a vast, wordless ocean. For the first time since Sid's collapse, Pink Floyd had a heartbeat again, and that heartbeat was David Gilmour's guitar. Rise of Pink Floyd. The early 1970s became the testing ground for what Pink Floyd would become without Syd Barrett. At first, their path was uncertain. Albums like A Saucer Full of Secrets and soundtrack work for films such as More and Obscured by Clouds were less about fame and more about survival. These projects gave the band time, money, and space to experiment in the shadows. And in that shadow, David Gilmour was quietly shaping the future of rock music. His guitar voice matured. The long delays, the aching bends, the infinite sustain. He refined them until they no longer sounded like notes, but like cries from somewhere deep inside the human soul. Then came Metal, 1971. Its centerpiece, Echoes, was not a song. It was an odyssey. 23 minutes of soundscape so vast that it felt like standing inside an ocean of music. The first shimmering ping of Gilmour's guitar cut through like a lighthouse in darkness, guiding listeners through a storm of sound. By the end, the band had forged a new identity, and from there they did not just rise, they soared. The Dark Side of the Moon 1973 was not an album. It was a cultural earthquake. David's voice carried through Breathe, his guitar wept through Time, and his scat lines entwined with Claire Torry's soaring cries on The Great Gig in the Sky. Even the clink of coins became sacred under his riffs and money. The record did not simply chart, it stayed there, 15 years dominating the Billboard charts, selling tens of millions, and defining an era. For the first time, Pink Floyd was not a cult band. They were the heartbeat of a generation. And at the center of it all stood David Gilmour, bending one note until it felt infinite, his solos turning massive stadiums into hushed cathedrals. But success carried shadows. When the band recorded Wish You Were Here, 1975, the grief of Syd Barrett's absence weighed heavy. The haunting opening of Shine On You Crazy Diamond was less a composition and more a funeral prayer. Each of its 4 notes dropped like a tear for a friend who was still alive, but unreachable, lost to madness. When David sang Wish You Were Here, it was not performance. It was confession. A man mourning a friendship while millions listened. The 1970s were years of triumph, but they were also years of ghosts. Conflicts, betrayals, and breakdowns. As the decade progressed, the brilliance of Pink Floyd turned inward. What had once been harmony began to fracture. Animals, 1977, revealed Roger Waters' venom in lyrics, while David Gilmour's guitar clawed for compassion. The tension simmered in the studio, growing sharper with every session. Then came The Wall, 1979. On stage, it was hailed as a masterpiece. Behind the scenes, it was war. The band was tearing itself apart. During the recording of Comfortably Numb, Waters demanded orchestral despair while Gilmour answered with fire. That clash birthed one of the greatest guitar solos ever recorded. 2 visions colliding, creating lightning. But victory came at a cost. Rick Wright, the quiet heart of the band and David's closest ally, was pushed out during recording. Reduced from equal member to hired hand. The betrayal wounded Gilmour deeply. By the time the Final Cut 1983 arrived, Pink Floyd was no longer a band. It was Roger Waters' manifesto. Gilmour himself described the experience bitterly. "I was reduced to a session player in my own band." The humiliation cut deep. His voice muted, his presence erased, his soul silenced. And then the unthinkable. Waters declared Pink Floyd finished. He walked away and tried to legally dissolve the band's name, as if 2 decades of Gilmour's blood, sweat, and sound had never mattered. For David, it was not just a professional defeat, it was erasure. A brutal rewriting of history where he was cast as nothing more than a replacement, a shadow, a man who had stood in someone else's shoes. But Gilmour was not finished. Gilmour's resurrection and Pink Floyd's rebirth. When the dust settled, David Gilmour made a choice. He would not disappear. He would not be silenced. With Nick Mason by his side and the memory of Rick Wright still flickering, he took back the name Pink Floyd. And against all odds, he began again. In 1987, a momentary lapse of reason was born. Critics scoffed. They called it weak, hollow, destined to fade. But then the lights went on. Stadiums filled. Audiences roared. The band's heartbeat returned, pulsing with Gilmour's guitar. 7 years later came the Division Bell, 1994. Its themes of communication, reconciliation, and healing mirrored Gilmour's own journey. This time, Rick Wright was restored as a full partner. The wounds of the past, at least for a moment, seemed to close. The world responded. Tours grossed hundreds of millions. Pulse immortalized their sound on stage. For the first time, David Gilmour no longer stood in Syd Barrett's shadow or fought Roger Waters' dominance. He was not a replacement. He was Pink Floyd. At last, his voice was undeniable. The man who had once pawned his guitar for food now stood at the peak of rock history. But even in triumph, shadows lingered, because every stage light eventually dims. And for David Gilmour, the applause was always followed by silence. The silence of ghosts he could never escape. Loss and ghosts. The mid-2000s brought a miracle no one thought possible. In 2005, the 4 classic members, David Gilmour, Roger Waters, Rick Wright, and Nick Mason, stood together on stage at Live 8. For one night only, the bitterness dissolved. The walls of ego and betrayal crumbled, and when they played Comfortably Numb, it was not just music, it was resurrection. A moment frozen in time, 4 men breathing as one, as if the years of anger had never existed. The roar of the crowd was thunder. Tears filled eyes across the world. For a heartbeat, it felt like time itself had forgiven them. But miracles are fragile. Just 3 years later, in 2008, the shadow returned. Rick Wright, David's quiet anchor, his brother in harmony, was gone, claimed by cancer at just 65. For Gilmour, it was the cruelest symmetry. Syd Barrett lost to madness, Rick Wright lost to death, and the band they had built reduced to ghosts and recordings. The grief cut deep. To the world, Rick was a keyboardist. To David, he was the unspoken glue, the calm presence, the man whose harmonies had steadied the storm. In 2014, David assembled the Endless River, woven from fragments of Wright's playing. To some, it was a final Pink Floyd album, but to Gilmour, it was a seance. Each note was a whisper from Rick across the divide, a farewell that could never be spoken in words. Fans heard music. David heard a voice that would never answer again. Personal life and relationships. While battles raged on stage, another war unfolded at home. In 1975, at the height of Pink Floyd's success, David married Virginia Ginger Hazenbein, a striking American model and artist. Their early years glowed with promise. Photographs showed a couple full of laughter, hope, and youth. For Gilmour, who had grown up in a home where warmth was scarce, marriage seemed like the chance to create the family he had longed for. They had 4 children: Alice in 1976, Claire in 1979, Sarah in 1981, and Matthew in 1986. But fame is rarely kind to family. The endless tours, the recording battles, the pressures of success. Slowly, the absences grew longer. The silences at home began to echo. By the late 1980s, the cracks were impossible to hide. David himself would later admit, "I was watching my marriage dissolve at the same time the band was breaking apart. I didn't realize how much damage was being done until it was too late." In 1990, the marriage quietly ended, not in scandal but in heartbreak. To the world, he was a rock icon. To himself, he was a man who could silence an arena but could not hold his family together. Yet from ruins, light often emerges. In the early 1990s, David met Polly Sampson, a novelist and journalist whose pen carried both tenderness and fire. With Polly, he did not just find love. He found a collaborator, a muse, and a partner who spoke the same language of art. They married in 1994, just as the division bell prepared to meet the world. And Polly's words flowed into the music, lines that would shape songs like High Hopes, turning private intimacy into public art. Together, they built a blended family of 8 children, filling the once silent halls of David's life with footsteps, arguments, laughter, and chaos. Friends recalled visiting their home and seeing a new man, not the haunted figure hunched over a guitar, but a father on the floor surrounded by toys, or a husband strumming gently while Polly scribbled notes beside him. For David Gilmour, it was resurrection. Not escape from pain, not perfection, but balance. Later years and legacy. In his later years, David Gilmour's life became less about stadium roars and more about intimate truths. His fortune, estimated at over $180 million, never consumed him. Unlike so many rock stars, he did not drown in excess. His treasures were not mansions of gold or fleets of limousines. They were places where music could breathe. He restored Astoria, a Victorian houseboat moored permanently on the River Thames, turning it into one of the most iconic recording studios in the world. Behind its glass walls, albums were born, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, The Division Bell, and his own solo works. For him, it was not property. It was a floating cathedral of sound. He poured his soul into Sussex, restoring Medina House, a mansion by the sea. He owned villas, Ferraris, and even a fleet of historic aircraft through his company, Intrepid Aviation. Yet these were not indulgences. For him, they were artifacts, living history to be restored, just as he restored music. But he never clung to wealth. In 2003, he sold a mansion for $3.6 million and gave every penny to Crisis, the homeless charity. In 2019, he auctioned 120 of his guitars, including the Black Strat itself, the very instrument that had carried Comfortably Numb and Shine On You Crazy Diamond. It sold for nearly $4 million, part of an auction that raised $21.5 million. Every cent went to climate charity Client Earth. "My guitars have served me well," he said softly. "Now it's time for them to serve the planet." This was David Gilmour in Twilight, a man who had known hunger and guilt, betrayal and grief, applause and redemption. A man who once pawned his guitar for food, now giving that very guitar away to save the world. And yet, the paradox of his Twilight remains. He walks the Sussex coast, hair silver, steps slower. He records at Astoria as the river murmurs outside. His face may be weathered, but when his fingers touch the strings, time itself seems to hesitate. A single note. Fragile. Infinite. Eternal. The boy who broke silence with a guitar now carries a silence filled with ghosts. Sid lost to madness. Rick lost to death. Roger estranged. Of the old guard, only Nick Mason remains, steady on the drums, a mirror of all that has been lost. David Gilmour's legacy cannot be counted in sales, tours, or riches. It lives in what his guitar has done for us all, turning grief into beauty, silence into speech, mortality into memory. He is proof that the greatest heroes do not need to shout. They only need to bend a single note until the whole world falls still, listening. When the stadium lights fade and the roar of thousands becomes silence, David Gilmour remains a man sitting with his guitar, surrounded by ghosts. He is 79 now. The years have silvered his hair, slowed his steps, softened his voice. But when his fingers touch the strings, time bends. A single note still hangs in the air like a breath between life and death. Fragile, infinite, unbroken. He no longer stands inside arenas built of brick and steel. His stage is quieter. The Sussex coast, the Astoria houseboat, his home filled with children, grandchildren, and the steady presence of Polly Sampson. A life rebuilt not on spectacle, but on belonging. Yet even in this piece, shadows follow. He turns to the side and only one of the old guard remains. Nick Mason, steady as ever on the drums. Not a rival, not a foe, but a mirror of everything they have lost. Sid Barrett, his childhood friend, gone to madness. Rick Wright, his quiet brother in harmony, taken by cancer. Roger Waters, estranged, divided by wounds that no melody could ever truly heal. What was once a quartet is now a duet. Every rehearsal echoes louder because of those who are no longer there. Every smile shared with Nick carries the weight of absence. Even the memory of their Ferrari road trip in 1988, two friends racing down highways like boys, feels today like a ghost chasing them through time. This is the paradox of David Gilmour's Twilight. Wealth vast enough to last lifetimes, yet meaning little. Family filling the silence once occupied by roaring crowds, yet always shadowed by those missing from the table. His true legacy is not measured in charts, sales, or riches. It lives in the way his guitar has carried us all, turning silence into speech, grief into beauty, mortality into memory. David Gilmour proves that the greatest heroes do not need to scream. They bend a single note until the world itself stops listening. And so the story does not end here. It continues every time a listener presses play on Wish You Were Here, or Comfortably Numb, or Shine On You Crazy Diamond. His voice lives in every tear, every shiver, every silence those songs still create. If David Gilmour has ever made you close your eyes and feel something you could not name, share it now. Did you first meet him through The Dark Side of the Moon? Did the Division Bell call to you? Or was it a single solo, one aching bend of a note that still lingers in your heart today? Leave a like. Leave a tribute. Carry his music further into the silence, further into the light. Because David Gilmour's tragedy is not only his wounds, it is the reminder that beauty too is born from brokenness. And that sometimes one man, one guitar, and one note are enough to echo across eternity.